Okay. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all, wherever you may be across the globe. My name is Nana Adom Aboagye, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar on shifting the narrative, data-driven approaches to girls' sports participation. Before we start, just a little housekeeping. You are all more than welcome to post questions in the Q&A. It is at the bottom of your screen. So please remember to post in the Q&A and not in the comments if you have any questions. And also to ensure that you address the questions to specific experts so that we can know who to ask the questions to. So the questions will all be addressed at the end of today's program, just to allow for a flow of information and interaction. So to kick us off, I would like to start with Dr. Lombé Mwambwa. She'll be kicking us off with our impulse topic. So with the impulse topic, she will be presenting on building evidence-based frameworks for girls' sport participation. Dr. Mwambwa received her PhD in sport organization leadership and women from the University of Chichester in the UK, and she's currently the CEO for the Global Observatory for Gender Equality and Sport, which is based in Lausanne, Switzerland. Dr. Mwambwa leads global efforts to promote gender equality in sport through research, policy, and strategic partnerships. Her contributions to sport also include research, policy development, teaching, and strategic advice through advisory boards, task groups, research groups, and networks of the UN, NGOs, international federations, research, and academic institutions around the world. Welcome, Lombé. It is good to see you again, and it is a pleasure to have you with us today. I will now hand over to you for you to take us through your impulse topic.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nana, for that introduction. And thank you to TAFISA and the team for this opportunity to join in this webinar and this really important discussion. I'm also really glad to see several colleagues on this in this session who we collaborate with and some who haven't seen in a while. And to get the sense that we have maintained that interest in our efforts for girls and women in sport, as that's one of the really important elements to fulfilling the kind of outcomes that we are all aiming for individually and collectively. Our views around girls and women are informed by the idea that girls exist in quite a diversity, and that girls' lives are impacted by a range of conditions, a range of influences and power systems that affect the quality of their lives, that also condition and channel how their lives will proceed and what they will have access to in terms of rights, what they will be able to benefit from in terms of the resources that are around them, as well as how far they could go in their rights being fulfilled and what they can do to fulfill that potential. So with that understanding, that there are all this diversity of conditions and realities, and that girls themselves have a diversity of how they experience these conditions. Our commitment to gender equality is based on this principle of inclusive gender equality, that we should be aiming to meet the needs and see girls and women in all their diversity around the world. And that is across the three fields of concern around physical education, physical activity, and sport. And just 10 days ago was the International Day of the Girl Child, that the world was commemorating this. And so it's really an apt moment for us to be having this conversation, to reflect together on what does it take, what is the role of data in how we design to address challenges, but also to take advantage of opportunities that can enable girls and women's engagement in sport. For the Global Observatory, we actively seek to engage three clusters of stakeholders. That's the academic community, sports organizations in all their sort of manifestation, as well as the different entities that relate to governments, including the intergovernmental bodies such as UN organizations and other such bodies. Now, all of this is important because these institutions each have a role to play in not only defining the frameworks of how we understand girls and women's rights and what gets advanced as government responsibility or as civil society recognizable action, but also in terms of what data is then made available, what data is collected, what data is seen as important to collect, to generate, analyze. Now, so far, I'd like to give a few examples of the data that we have seen being mobilized or generated from across these three different clusters of stakeholders that I've highlighted. One form of data that I'd like to highlight is the time use data. This is data where you document across 24 hours how do individuals spend their time, whether it's paid work or unpaid work or leisure or work. Now, this kind of data is usually collected periodically, and it's across different countries. And this is really important and useful for us, as over the years it has been used to highlight the differences in the kind of time allocation and expectation of time allocation across and how this is gendered, and how this also reflects the sort of norms, practices, and expectations that are shaped by the understanding that girls' and women's time belongs to everyone and is structured in a way that limits how much leisure time they have and how they can spend that leisure time. So looking at this kind of data can help us design sports programs that respond not only to fit in the amount of time that girls have, but to challenge how much time girls can have for their own engagement in physical activity as well as in sport. And it allows for a true reflection of which parts of the population are really benefiting from any resources that are available if they don't have time to make use of it. There's physical inactivity data that's being collected and developed through especially the World Health Organization, this global survey that they track. And this data tells us across almost all the countries that girls and women get insufficient physical activity. Now, this data is important as it helps us to see which age ranges. Is it adolescence or is it early childhood? Where do you see those differences? So all of these are sort of really large data sets. But where some of the gaps are for data that's not available is around what investments is going into physical activity, physical education, and sport, and whether this reaches girls and which girls actually can benefit from these investments. Even at a very basic question around what community facilities are available for engagement in sport and physical activity, we find that this data is not consistently available. And also, even where you do have a physical count of what facilities are available, we don't have the usage tracking to see how girls and women can benefit. So getting an understanding of this data that already exists and what it can tell us about how we need to design programs is useful for the work that we do to advance girls and women's engagement. Now, if we also take the view that we need data that helps us understand what the enablers are, what conditions do we need in place to sustain girls and women's engagement in sport, what barriers are there, and what capacity exists to actually deliver and fulfill girls and women's rights to sport. And also what actions actually produce the kind of results we're aiming for. If we collaborate this with the other data that is collected because of the interests of larger stakeholders like governments, it can help us then to frame our programming and our design in a way that that can respond to the needs of girls and women at scale, at a large scale. The Global Observatory contributes to this effort by highlighting what data is available, highlighting what kind of resources are needed to support those who are looking for particular interventions, and this is sharing good practice and initiatives that are working, by highlighting where you have the expertise that actually focuses on this particular topic, so that if you are going to work on this data or going to work on initiatives, you have the right people to collaborate with. And through this knowledge hub, also we're sharing the different frameworks that exist to reinforce the significance of the work that needs to be done related to girls and women. And one key thing that we'd like to highlight about data and about evidence is that a lot of this data, some of which I have illustrated to you, exists. However, the questions we also have to address about this data is, to what extent is this data really about girls, or is it about whole populations incorporating girls in a very small way, or incorporating some clusters of girls, maybe adolescent girls, or maybe girls in urban areas, or girls who are in formal school institutions? So is it really about girls in all their diversity? And how has this data been generated, analyzed, and communicated? Has this been done with the participation of girls themselves? Or we take the approach of, we are the experts and all the adults and institutions go ahead and do this on behalf of girls, and girls are to be spoken about and spoken for, but not engaged in the process. And yet we do know that there are commitments even through the different Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Beijing Platform for Action, the CEDAW, and so many other efforts where it is recognized and agreed that we must engage girls and adolescents in general in all that we're doing around policy and programming. And to what extent is the data then utilized to actually undertake action that benefits girls? And again, the question becomes, which girls actually benefit from some of the programming that we design, where we say we're doing this for girls, with girls? Is there an impulse to restrict ourselves to urban areas because then we are working online and with internet access, and it seems easier and fits in the time we have to fulfill our log frame with funders? So again, we have to think about which girls, and are we really doing this for girls? And to what extent does this really get sustained and not a one-off? I'd like to leave us with a call to action around some very tangible things we need to do, which is to really listen to girls in the work that we're doing, that we're not only making assumptions or surveying them, but that we actually listen to what information they provide us, and that we really take it into our efforts. I'd like us also to ensure that we are engaging them across the sphere of the different spheres and across the cycle of our work, and that it's consistent. And that we are facilitating the opportunities for girls to connect with each other, not only girls within the particular sports field, but across different spheres, because there's so much to learn from other sectors as well. And that when these initiatives are going on or have been completed, that it's not just closed off and it's finished. We did a project about data and girls, or we did a project where we interviewed girls, but that it becomes a principle about how we work, and not necessarily just a one-off of it was popular that year or there was grant funding that year for working with girls and so we did it. So the challenge that we'll have as stakeholders that I leave us with is, how can we make this really a living principle that we consistently work with? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lombé, for your insightful presentation. To those who've just joined us online, my name is Nana Aboagye, and I'll be your moderator for this webinar. Now, Lombé, before you leave us, I'd just like to ask, you did present a lot of information, and I liked your call to action. So in terms of your view and the work that the Global Observatory is doing, the data that is currently available and or needed, which of these do you think is the most influential in understanding girls' participation in sport, especially linked to your current call for action at the end of your presentation?
Oh, that's a difficult one. I think some of the things that's important to bear in mind is data is segmented according to, first of all, the contextual data that tells us about girls' lives in general. Then we also need data that's telling us about the conditions in which they live, what the status of the country or the community, what exists there. And thirdly, what are the sort of sporting opportunities, what is desired, what are you starting with, and where do you want to go? So it's more or less a combination and not necessarily just one form of data needed more than the other. And it's really important that with each community or sector or region, that we start with where are we trying to get to, and which girls' lives are we trying to impact, which communities are we trying to engage, because sometimes there's a focus on girls in high performance sport and perhaps we don't need to know more there, or we need to know something else there than we need to know for girls who are in recreational sport or in sport in schools. So starting with the question of who are the girls that we are trying to engage are and what their needs are becomes really important.
Thank you so much, Lombé. That was actually very insightful. And I do agree with you that we need to approach it in a multi-pronged approach, asking those two simple questions. Who do we need to assist and how can we assist them? But even to add on to that, it's also about getting their voices into the conversation as well, hearing their perspectives and using that to guide us in terms of the data. Thank you so much, Lombe. And I'm sure your viewers will be interested once you shared your presentation through TAFISA at the end. So now I'd like to move on to our interactive break. So our interactive break, there is a link that will be shared in the chat as well as a QR code, which will now go on the screen. So with our interactive break now, we just want you to answer two simple questions just to get where your thoughts are. So the first, of course, the first question would be, what has been the biggest barrier to collecting systematic data on girl sport participation in your organization or within your specific context? We'll just wait a moment for everyone to access the link or the QR code, and then we'll show the responses on the screen. And of course, the second question, does your organization rely on data when designing sport programs? Okay. Okay, I think people are still responding, but it's interesting to see, and it's actually, I think, quite comforting that a lot of organizations or individuals do use data to actually plan their sporting programs. Those who are not sure, perhaps you are doing so without even realizing it yourself, because data is all around us. Rachel, could we perhaps also see the previous question? Yes, what has been the biggest barrier to collecting systematic data? Okay, so some of the responses, time and knowing where to go, willingness to share, funding for tools, resources, limited tech, methodologies in place which can be used universally, poor focus on gender studies, willingness, time, and money. Okay, segmentation, awareness of data use at local level, poor focus on gender studies. So looking at the responses thus far, it seems that there are common themes, generally time, understanding, and of course, resources at the end of the day, and knowledge sharing. Knowledge sharing is a bit of a challenge within our space. And I do hope that with the panel discussion, our experts will be able to provide insight to some of the challenges or the barriers that you have indicated here. Lack of awareness and interest. Okay, thank you so much, Rachel. Now we are moving on to our panel discussion, and I'd like to start off by introducing each panelist before we actually start delving into the discussions for the day. So our first panelist is Dylan Richardson, who's the Director of Membership Services and Sport Development for the World Flying Disc Federation. Dylan holds a master's degree from the University of Windsor in human kinetics, specializing in sport management. He has extensive experience at national and international sport federations, as well as organizing committees, and is familiar with supporting diverse membership and stakeholders, as well as developing grassroots development and high performance programming. Welcome, Dylan, and thank you for joining us today. Next, we move on to Dr. Eve Lane, Head of Department of Sport and Health Sciences at the Technological University of the Shannon in Ireland. Dr. Lane holds a PhD in Women's Physical Activity from the then Waterford Institute of Technology. She's currently the lead of the SHE Research Center, which aims to bridge the gender data gap in sport, health, and exercise research. Dr. Lane's current research projects are on equality in leadership, female athlete role models, menopause, and female athlete health. She's also a member of the Sports Island Women in Sport Committee. Welcome, and thank you for joining us as well today. We then move on to Professor Rosa López de Marco, who's the president of the International Society for Comparative Physical Education and Sports, as well as an invited professor and the national coordinator of the EFL program at the Universidad Nacional Experimental del Magisterio, which UNEM, or Teachers Training University in Venezuela. Her research experience is quite extensive, and she has focused on physical education, comparative studies in sport, gender, sport policy, sport management, culture, and literature. She's an editorial board member of various academic journals, and she also has more than 78 refereed papers, 40 books, 6 preceding books, 74 chapters in books, and 35 research projects. Welcome, Professor Rosa, and thank you for joining us today. And finally, we move on to Professor Rosa Diketmueller, who is an associate professor at the University of Vienna, as well as the president of the International Association of Physical Education and Sport for Girls and Women. Professor Diketmueller holds a PhD in sports science, focusing on sports geography. In 1997, she founded the Austrian Platform for Women in Sports, and since 2024, she has been the president of Sport for the Austrian Competence Center on Gender Equity in Sport, a member of the Austrian Steering Group on Gender Equality in Sports, a leader of the Working Group on Gender-Based Violence in Sport, and a former member of the European Expert Pool on Sexual Violence in Sport. Welcome, Prof. Diketmueller, and thank you for joining us. So, of course, as you can see on your screen, we have 2 Professor Rosas. So I'll be referring to Rosa DeMarco, and then Prof. Rosa. I'll just say Rosa for Prof. Diketmueller, just to differentiate. So I would like to start off the discussion with an icebreaker for all of you. We will go in the order of introduction. So the question that I would like you all to answer in the order of introduction would be, if you could have access to one piece of data or research about girls in sport that doesn't currently exist or that you cannot access, what would it be and why? Dylan, if we can start with you.
Yeah, happy to start, and thank you for the introduction. So I think the biggest one for World Flying Disc would be research that's sport specific. There's lots about football, there's lots about athletics. Dr. Lombé highlighted, I think, the piece of data wanted most about the enablers of what keeps girls participating in sport, but definitely that it's sport specific, where growing or developing sports. We're not as popular as football. There's not as peaked interest in academia. So maybe I'm answering a question that may come, but engaging with academia to get more research focused on our sport, to understand it better, to better design programs and better address that for our community.
Okay, thank you for that thought-provoking response. Now I'll move on to Aoife. What is your response on the question?
Yeah, what I would love is some sort of consensus data on the systemic influences on girls and women's participation in sport. We have lots of individual societal and environmental projects running separately, but you would love to collate that like we do for the determinants of physical activity or the determinants of health, and have an overall picture of, I suppose, the depth of the systemic influences in particular on how girls engage and participate in sport.
Okay, thank you for that. Prof. Rosa D'Amaco, your response to the question?
Yes, good morning. And actually, this is a very complex question because we would like to have so many information around it, and it's quite hard to decide about only one in particular. But I really would love to see the data where we have at the club level, at the grassroots level, women's participation in leadership positions, because we have information related with top levels, but at grassroots level, and I always said I'm convinced, but still we have to show data, like women are participating much more in leadership position. Yes, particularly when it is voluntary work. So that's the one I would love at the moment, but there are so many, very difficult, Dr. Dana.
It's very true. I mean, there are so many avenues that we could follow, but I think this question, even though it is difficult, I do believe that it will get our audience to start thinking and start sharing their viewpoints as well. So to you, Prof. Rosa, also the same question. What one piece of data would you pick and why?
I would have answered the same way as the other Rosa. I think it's a systemic aspect, and you have to consider so many factors. And if you want to be successful, you need all of these different factors. But if I have to decide one, if it would not be the question about dropout and in which ages which girls are leaving, I would be very interested about the simple indicator about which sports offers are existing for girls in combination or in relation to those for the boys on a global agenda, because if there is no offer, they can't take part. And this would be an interesting aspect besides so many others you've already mentioned, but this would be interesting for me. What are the offers? Are there enough? My opinion would be there are not enough for them, and it's not seen that the offers are missing.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that insight. So to the viewers as well, I hope you've taken note to the responses that our experts have given. And I think I would challenge you. Almost everyone has introduced themselves within the chat. So as you're listening and also taking note of who is available in the chat, reach out, send private messages, and you never know, there is potential for collaboration for those who are tuned in today. You can reach out to each other. It doesn't always have to be formal research, but even sharing of information and knowledge within your spaces. Because I do think at least one of you has possibly looked into what has been mentioned by our experts, and you could share that with everyone else. Now, I'd like to move on to the more individualized panel questions and discussion. So again, I'll start with you, Dylan. So from your experience, how has the World Flying Disc Federation approached building a data system that accurately reflects girls' participation?
Yeah, we're pretty lucky. So back in the day, or in 2002, we're conducting an annual census. So we have a pretty strong data set that through our membership, they're submitting every year detailed data of we're having 5 key disciplines by discipline, by age group. We're having this data set from 2002. So able to see the growth of women's participation in the different disciplines across age groups from that period. on top of our high performance data of at our own championships or at our own events that we control, the accreditation data of the number of athletes that are registered, kind of uniquely compared to different sports. Ultimate, our most popular discipline, is a mixed gender sport, and that's like the roots of the sport are positioned this way from the grassroots to the high performance level. So even at our world championships, our most contested division is mixed gender. So really it's built, that annual census provides from the grassroots to the high performance level kind of this breakdown of our data set, and it's kind of what we rely on. And on top of some of the accreditation data, on top of we're having a learning management system, so we're able to see kind of in leadership positions the breakdown of coaches, who is learning and who's accessing our services.
Okay, so I'd like to just touch on, you mentioned, I think in your opening, that you have a strong data set that is submitted annually. So if you don't mind sharing with myself and the participants, what were the methods that were used in order to get you to where you are in terms of data collection and application?
Yeah, I think seeing the importance of, or we didn't have a centralized licensing system, or we wanted to have a good outlook on the entire sport in a simple way. And I think compared to other international federations, or we wanted to have a good outlook on the grassroots. And if you're only looking at high performance data, you're not getting a full look on your system and seeing kind of where the gaps are. So building this in, making it convenient for our membership to submit this data, and kind of valuing it and actually taking that data and trying to action it to make smart decisions in terms of our programming, in terms of adaptations to our rules, and truly impacting our sports.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, I move on to Eva. In your view, what are the biggest blind spots in our current understanding of girls' participation and retention in sport?
Yeah, for me, I think it maybe links to my first answer. It's around those systemic influences. I think we have failed to think about how sport is set up and structured for girls right from when they are, their entry point, from when they're babies and their parents are giving them a pram or a doll instead of a ball, right through to when they start school and maybe they're not encouraged to do the physical education classes as much, or sometimes they join a sports club when they're a little bit older than boys. So it always feels to me like they're a little bit behind. And if we look at the data we do have around participation and retention, and it's linked to enjoyment and perceived competence and confidence in sport, you can see the connection. If the girl is always a little bit behind, then that feeds into those factors that we do understand. So I think I'd really like that we, first of all, collect data to understand that a little bit more, but then that we communicate it and we, share that with parents and schools and sports clubs and policymakers to, I suppose, show to them it's not the girl's fault. Like a lot of the time, it's the way the system is set up that is really providing these systemic barriers to their engagement in sport and physical activity. So I think that granular piece is possibly missing. And equally, the influence of sex-specific experiences. Do we know enough about how breasts or the menstrual cycle or urinary incontinence, how do those things impact participation in sport and physical activity? We're just starting to talk about those things, but I still think we're a little bit behind on how much they actually influence a young girl's participation in sport.
Thank you for that. And you actually answered my follow-up question, which was what kinds of research or innovative methods should we be looking at to help address these gaps more effectively? So I like how you touched on, physical development in terms of menstruation and breast development. So, I mean, being from Africa, I live in Cape Town, South Africa. So I know in the African context, such topics are very difficult to have in conversation. So how would you advise a more conservative setting to approach discussions and even research with such topics?
Yeah, I think initially it starts with health literacy. If you frame it within health and personal health and well-being, I think that is a good gateway into how it then impacts other areas of life. But my understanding, particularly in Ireland, we're somewhat privileged and we probably are doing okay. But even in Eastern Europe or Africa, it probably is still very much a taboo. So I think building it into education and health literacy is the gateway perhaps for it to become a relevant factor in conversations about sport and physical activity. I think what we do know about coaches is they struggle to talk about it. They don't understand it. Their literacy is poor. So maybe another piece of the jigsaw is to support coaches and parents in terms of their menstrual health literacy or literacy about breast health or whatever. So yeah, I think we do have to, yes, look after the athlete and the girl, but I think it's educating and supporting her system. Her sports system is really important as well to, I think, bridge that challenge that probably exists to a greater extent in certain regions, which is interesting to me. You know, as I said, we can be privileged and making progress, and then we realize that it's more challenging in other contexts.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed that response, and it does give food for thought. Now I move on to Prof. Rosa DiMarco. When we look at culture, especially looking at where everyone comes from, where everyone is logged on from this webinar, culture plays a big role in shaping how girls experience sport. So in your career, what patterns have you identified or seen across different contexts? Whether it be in Venezuela or anywhere else in the world where you've done work. So what are similar patterns that you have identified?
Thank you for that question, because actually what we have identified in several cultures is education itself. I mean, we need more education. And in here, I want to link two of the Sustainable Development Goals, because normally when we speak about gender, we just refer to number 5. But actually, we have to work closer with number 4, because it refers to quality education. And physical education is a component of the education system. So if any countries are working in terms of quality education, then physical education should be included in there, in the education system. So this is a common pattern that I observe, that normally people will just ignore or just forget to link with that one, because in that sense, we could have more avenues in order to challenge the actual situation in which sometimes we have girls who never had a chance to participate in a physical education class. The other element when I insist on education is teachers training, because you could have the best facilities ever, but if your teachers are not trained in order to work with inclusive education, then we are not doing much. So we need to work harder in that sense. So do teachers receive enough training? And we know from recent data that it is not the reality. So we have, in my opinion, from our different ends, our different organizations, try to focus a bit more in that aspect, because if it is quite true that we might say that it's good, perhaps the situation in one place of the world, it is not enough. I mean, if we want to challenge the actual situation of women's participation, girls and women participation in sport, we have to start from the base. And we have to look at different places, because otherwise it will be like the butterfly effect, okay? We believe we are okay and that's enough. Well, that's not enough. We have to struggle harder in order to make it work for everybody, for all women, girls and women, everywhere, respecting their cultural difference and background.
Okay. Thank you, Prof. Rosa. So I want to follow up on that, especially since you mentioned that, you know, education is a component, especially physical education as a component of the education system. I'm not sure if there are those who are on this webinar today who come from a similar context as ours, but in South Africa, we no longer have physical education in the system. There are, I guess, some schools, maybe the private schooling system, where they do try. So in a context where the education is not formalized in terms of physical education being a component, what advice would you give for those who want to now start bringing in that, that level of education to young girls? Maybe it's an NGO or maybe it's an after schools program. What advice could you perhaps give?
Well, in some places, it is not called physical education. It has other different names due to a particular history in each one of the curriculum in different countries. However, there's always a sort of physical activity component, because particularly after COVID, it's like this disgrace brought something, and it opens the eye to many that physical activity, it's important for the human being existence. So that's why in some curriculums, they started to look at that place. And as I said, it might not be called PE, it's called health, has different name, and others have included after school activities. Nevertheless, I do push forward that it should be a physical education or physical activity and health, the way it is called, because if our countries are working with the SDGs, and particularly we know UNESCO has a strong project since 2015, 2014 on QPE, Quality Physical Education, and all of them are signatories of that. So we have to push forward in order to make it visible in that sense. After school activities, sometimes if parents have to pay for that, that is not good. That is not enough. That is not what we refer quality education. Quality education, it's a big concept, but according to arriving to agreements in what it is, we look for the concept that UNESCO is providing. And in there, physical activity, the inclusion of girls, the inclusion of minorities, it's an important element. So the information is there, but people won't be empowered if they don't know that it exists. Okay, so my suggestion again is more education to make it more visible, even in our own countries. Sometimes you can have in our own countries, like in the statistics, for example, national statistic, sport or physical activity doesn't appear there. In big events, even about women's event, sports and physical activity is not there. So we have to struggle much more in order to make it visible as an important component of human development in society.
Thank you so much for that response. I really appreciate it. It does give one reflection and pause for thought. Now I'll move on to our other Prof. Rosa. Reflecting on your experience, what do you believe can be done to ensure that local and community level data on girls' participation in sport is not overlooked when it comes to global reporting?
This is a very important question, because very often data from the local level do not get up to the global perspective. And it would be, on the one hand, very important to implement standardized local templates to build up bottom-up reporting framework. I think this would be important. Start on the local level, standardize templates, create collection tools. For example, in Austria, we were included in the all-in data collection from the European Commission. And we've got the questionnaire, we fill it out, but then it would be necessary to develop more or less community dashboards, for example. And these data could then be implemented into a broader system going to the European Commission or to the Global Observatory, which aim is to collect data on the global level, but they have to come from the local ones. And in the local area, you also have to train and empower the local data collectors so that they ask same questions, but it's very difficult what sports, for example, means. It's totally different between cultures, which Rosa already told that you have to reflect the cultural background, which means the data collection instruments won't be the same, but anyway, they have to be comparable in a way, then it makes sense. And I think this could be one opportunity to build up these data systems, collection systems. For example, in Austria, we really tried hard to get data. We don't have them yet. It would be easier if you just, for example, the All-In project was something like this. Austria got the questionnaire, and then all the 67 federations started collecting their data and tried to fill it out. This should be systematized, I would say, that it's possible to put on one button and you get the data each day, and that all the federations and clubs don't have to answer always different questionnaires because they are getting tired of answering questionnaires. There should be a system to put in the data where you can have good indicators in and you can get the results each day, a year, at the actual moment. So developing such systems would be very, very helpful and could help because it's necessary to have the data. If you want to make interventions, you need the basic data. Otherwise, you don't know if there are good results or not. You need basic data to develop good interventions, and therefore it would be helpful. Start with a good system on the local, regional level, national level, which fits to the bigger ones, for example, Europe, the example in Europe here, and then fitting to the global ones. This would be, I think, very important.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think just to follow up on that, I know that there may be some viewers on this webinar who may come from less urbanized areas and maybe slightly rural context where maybe they do not have access or have limited access to experts who can support them on developing some of these standardized collection tools. How would you advise that they start the process?
Difficult questions because it's from culture to culture,
Sorry.
right? Different, I would say. If you can convince them that it helps the sports system to plan in a better way, which means that you can also save a bit of money in it because you know exactly what's going on, you have the data, and you make it as easy as possible and as useful as possible. And if you can tell them, then you don't have to do it 3 times, 4 times, 5 times a year, but just one time, and this is a good basis for all the other things, then it maybe helps. In Austria, political pressure helps as well a bit.
Yes, political pressure. In some environments, that can or cannot work, but I think it's always necessary to make an attempt at that. Thank you for sharing that. Now I come back up to Dylan. So reflecting on your career at the international federation level, because you have spent some time at the international level, what has really worked to get national associations to prioritize participation? Is it incentives, accountability measures, or is there another way to incentivize prioritization? Because that is a challenge currently in girls' participation.
Yeah, well, as a condition of good standing in our federation, submitting the annual census and submitting the data is kind of the basis, the same as the condition of initial membership. Having a non-discrimination clause and inclusion policy is a condition of membership, which is kind of like the very minimal baseline. Incentivizing high performance side, our ranking list to qualify for multi-sport games, or is prioritizing it equally values our women's division, our open or men's division, and our mixed division. So to qualify to our multi-sport games like the World Games, country needs to be participating in all 3, which coming from the weightlifting world, that was individual sport, we weren't able to push this as much. So I think this is like at the high performance side, this is a really, really positive thing that it kind of enforces this, and it's a really good thing. And countries that want to pursue the high performance level, they really need to invest in our mixed division and women's division. compared to solely focusing compared to other team sports like football is, I guess, the contrast where the investment or focus in development is so unequal. And based on our rule set, we're really enforcing this. What incentivize? I think just touching on some things that people have said about like developing capacity, education, interventions, we're really trying to provide centralize and provide the tools to kind of upskill our community. We're knowing lots of our stakeholders are very technically focused. I think Dr. D'Amico is speaking a little bit about leadership, and we're really happy to collaborate with TAFISA on the Girls Positive Coaching Pathway, and focusing not only on female or increasing the number of female coaches, but upskilling the male coaches to have difficult conversations that aren't so familiar, and incentivizing that by providing certificates. So at the grassroots level, promoting this or kind of providing this carrot or this reward of the proof of accreditation is trying to incentivize that. And in terms of programming or implementation, really trying to, I think, touching on Dr. Rosa's comment of like monitoring evaluation tools, our annual census is a bit that for our community, but in terms of interventions or programs, trying to provide it, or like our whole strategy is providing turnkey solutions. So having a girls participation program, we're having 122 members on all corners of the world that are all coming from different contexts in terms of budget, in terms of capacity, in terms of reality, in terms of access to equipment. So providing kind of the template resources in terms of curriculum, in terms of monitoring evaluation, that they could take and adjust to their realities, centralize it so the reporting is through one system on top, in addition to the census. So we have kind of the power and the numbers, understanding of the context, and we're providing a solution for them where we're not reinventing the wheel completely. The US is building a specific program. We're also having Japan, we're having Botswana, which are three completely different realities in across every factor, but trying to provide that turnkey solution that national federation, that leader in whatever community to take that and implement it and make change and increase the number of female participants for playing our sport, which is what we want to do.
Okay. Thank you for that. And I liked how you touched on curriculum. So I think for a lot of the viewers, there is curriculum available if you never know where to start. When it comes to participation, increasing participation, there are MOOCs and there are various forms of curriculum freely available online for you to have a look at. And I'm hoping, Dylan, maybe you'll be able to share a link to your curriculum so that some participants can have a look, so that TAFISA can share it, and then they can see what they can learn from it and then use that to guide them to developing their own. So thank you for that. Now, if I go to Aoife, how do you think organizations, be it an NGO or an international federation or a national federation, how do you think that these organizations, various organizations, can move from collecting data to using it effectively in designing interventions so that we can try to bridge the gap between academic research and practical application?
Yeah, it is a very real problem in all disciplines, not just this no-do gap where there is a slow or even limited impact on policy and practice from the research that we do. So I think there are two strands here. Number one is that you have very much integrated knowledge translation, so that you include the NGO or the end user, the girl, the coach, the parent in the design and development of your research, which means that they are more integrated and involved from the start, and they can help develop something that's relevant to them and maybe have more engagement with the output at the end. And from a researcher perspective, it helps with recruitment and the success of your project as well. So I think that's the first piece, to really integrate and do participatory research better and more often. The second piece is how you translate and disseminate your research at the end of a project. So traditionally, we would publish papers which is great and it's lovely and we have to do them, and we also attend conferences. But I think there's a greater responsibility for us to think about how we can actually communicate the research to the wider population. We've done some work in Ireland, and 1/3 of 600 people who responded to a survey on women in sport research said that they access research all the time. But most of them are accessing that through social media. So they're not going to our papers or our conferences. So we really need to think about novel dissemination strategies, whether that's podcasting, storytelling, infographics, attending more public-facing events, perhaps like this. I think that needs to be integrated into a research plan as much as we integrate our publications and our conferences. And I think there's almost a responsibility on the bigger funding system to make sure that that's included in our funding submissions and in our research planning, so that we actually have a greater responsibility and we do better on that. So they're just some ideas from my perspective.
Thank you for sharing your perspective, and I completely agree. We need to reimagine how we share information, especially with implementers and those on the ground. It doesn't help us if, as researchers, you produce knowledge and information and it's not understood or it's not, able to be used or accessed. So thank you for sharing those insights. Now I'll move on to Prof. Rosa DiMarco. So you've mentioned physical education and schools as well. So schools do play a powerful role in shaping how girls experience sport. You've touched on that. So in your view, how does physical education today in 2025 help challenge gender barriers or sometimes reinforce them?
Yes. Thank you for your question, because that definitely makes me speak about how relevant it is to speak about habits. And when do we create habits? Since childhood. So that's why to have QP, an inclusive view of QP, is so important, because it is perhaps the first time a girl or a boy might see one girl being the captain of the team. And then in that process, just with that example, then he can see the world from a different perspective. So I think it is a unique place in which we can work together. We can find elements that really make them look for ways how we communicate in our own society. There is not only one model, and there isn't only one example with a specific sport. We have to start first with our traditional games, with the elements that they do have. It's like we have to make our PE teachers look at those elements, those resources that we have at hand, and from there, how we can start working and building together. So it's like made them inclusive. So that's why, and in here I bring the comparative elements. Sometimes when we try to compare with other cultures, it is good to know what is happening, but also we have to face the reality we have that is very rich and it's unique. So sometimes having just the possibility to be working the whole year around, for example, for some tropical countries, outdoors could be another type of experience that we can create and we can build. But if we just have the focus on sport specific or skill through sport, then we forget the target. We forget the target that we have to make it inclusive, and that physical education is more than sport. Sports is a component of physical education. And there are other elements in there in which we can make all the students with all their difference, with all their potential, to make them feel unique and explore, but not just explore, also to share their unique characteristic with the group. Okay, so that comes from a good leadership and a good PE teacher. So that's why then I have to mention again education, and what avenues, what possibilities are we providing our teachers in service to be trained. Normally we say there's lots of information in the web. Wait a minute, that's not a normal answer. What happens if they don't have internet possibilities, access? So we need to work local. We need to focus on what we have. And I like an expression that I first heard for someone who is among the participants, Dr. Darlene Kluka. So when she said local, so we have to be local, think global, but you have to look at your roots, the potentials that you have that are unique. And then from there, we can start developing, okay? So it's also creating a community in which how we can support each other. And I want to just mention a bit of what the question you asked to Dr. Lane in terms of the organizations. Many organizations are run by volunteers, but we can support each other. We can, in a way, do work together that can make and understand the situation in different areas of the world. Some have strength in one area and others in other places of the world. We have beautiful examples, for example, the Comparative Society and IAPESGW, that here Rosa is the president of IAPESGW, like working together. Also, well, TAFISA is giving an example today of bringing different leaders of academic organization here, so we can share, because as I said, we don't have this strength in all regions of the world, but we want data from all regions of the world, so we need to work together. Okay.
Thank you so much for sharing that as well. And I can see already in the chat that it is getting conversation started. So thank you. Now, finally to you, Prof. Rosa, from your position now leading an international organization that focuses on girls and women in sport, can you maybe give us an example, share with us an example of a successful evidence-based intervention that has created sustainable change somewhere in the world or amongst your members?
Thank you so much for these very important questions. Maybe something to say before I start with the answer. It was IAPESGW together with other women's sports organizations that asked UNESCO and others that it's necessary that we get a global observatory for gender equality in sports, because we do not have the data on a global level. And that's what we are doing today, is discussing how we could fill this and how we could develop instruments to fulfill this task, because we know we do not have enough data, and in so many countries of the world, there is no data where we can start. Our association, so far we did not have that much examples that we're working successfully evidence-based. We had different projects. Rosa López was the president at the time, where we were working together, for example, in Madagascar, where different physical education and pedagogical associations work together, the Coaching Association, the Comparative Pedagogical Association, IAPESGW, our association, where they tried to figure out what is the need there and what could be done in terms of intervention. And this process was, and this project was done with the persons from the country. So they went there, they were asking what are the needs. So starting from the basis, getting the information of those who are there and developing with them their ideas. It's not to bring the ideas from all over the world to specific countries. As Rosa Didamico told, you have to think locally, think globally, but to act locally. And this is a very important thing. What we've done in our association is starting to sensitize and to highlight the already existing inspiring female leaders. So under Rosa's presidency, we've done continental books to highlight the inspiring women who are already there since 100 years or longer. They were active, but they are not seen, their stories are not told. And I think this is one of the starting points to make them visible so that the young girls get role models which are already existing. So you don't have to find new ones, there are existing ones. And this is a very important aspect. And for example, in Latin America, in Asia, starting with this type of books, there were also other books where the data were collected about how is the situation for girls and women in the countries, in different countries where no data have been visible so far. And this is really one of the big legacy from Rosa López, the MICO's presidency, to collect first part of this data, to get an impression what's going on in the world, what's going on with girls in PE and sports in the world. And I think this was a very important starting point. And now we can go further with the monitoring systems and the Global Observatory instruments.
Thank you very much for sharing that. And it is important in terms of what Professor Rosa touched on, is that you need to include your participants. You need to include those that you're all actually trying to assist with your work or your advocacy. So thank you for that. So all of you have provided insightful and thought-provoking insights. So as we close this panel discussion, I'd just like to maybe ask one simple question, I think, just for all of you, one simple question of all of you. What collective action, in just one simple sentence or two, what collective action can our viewers, what collective action can they take going forward if they want to be part of the change or see a difference in data collection or dissemination or application? I'll start with you, Dylan, since I always start at the top.
You could go reverse at the end, it's okay.
Okay. Okay, let's go reverse. Okay, so I will start with Prof. Rosa D'Amaco. What sentence or two, what collective action that people can take forward going forward after this webinar?
Okay, I will start with one thought by a very famous person, with Mandela, that says, if you want to see the change happen, you have to start with yourself, okay? So we have to start by each one of us. What are we doing to make it visible? What are we doing to change? And at what level? So it could be at home. It has to be at home. You have to be a model at home, but you also have to do it with your community and then go beyond. I mean, the possibilities that provides you that are there. So take advantage of that, because every single step counts, okay? Every single element that we do in order to move forward, it counts. And I always say to my students, maybe I'm on here, I have the next Minister of Education, Minister of Sport, or the President. So I give my message everywhere. We believe in equality. We believe that we could have a better possibilities, that the world can be a better place if we respect each other. And it starts by treating others how we would like to be treated, okay? So in every space that we are, if it is a school, don't feel that you cannot do anything. No, this is the place where you can do much more, because you will be educating the future leaders, the future members of your society. So each one of us, each one of those participating in this seminar, and also the ones who will be watching afterwards, think of what you can do from your own perspective in your own place. And this is where it starts. Remember, from bottom up lasts longer than it comes from up down, okay? So it can have further impact if you start making it change in your own community.
Thank you for sharing that. Now I'll move to our second Professor Rosa. What one collective action can people take forward after this webinar?
Coming back to data collection, which is also one of the questions, I totally agree what Rosa López said. So I bring the data collection. I think it's very, very helpful to have data, not only for collecting them, but knowing what's going on, because if you know what's going on in your country, in your region, in your federation, helps you to think about what could be next steps, what could be problems, and what could be good ideas or interventions to solve these problems. Very often, the situation of girls is not seen. Everybody thinks they will do something, will be okay. Normally, it's not very clear what their situation is, and to have an image and a picture of it could help to move further and to bring the gender relations in a better balanced way.
Thank you. Now I move on to Evie, the same question.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's just succinctly, it's to look for more interdisciplinary perspectives. So to try and ask for projects that think more about the individual and consider the systemic influences. So that needs sometimes a sociologist or a psychologist, or as well as the physiologist or the nutritionist. So I'd like people to challenge that we have a wider narrative when we try to understand girls' engagement in sport.
Thank you. And of course, last but not least, Dylan, your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks. I think just quickly specific on the data, be open to sharing. I think Dr. Lombé highlighted really nicely that for in a non-academic way, the type of data points you could be looking at. And I think being open to sharing, like our philosophy at our federation is being very open source and being willing to share everything. And I think if more actors in the space are willing to share the monitoring and evaluation tools and not gatekeeping access to certain things, it'll make the whole system better, even at that local context, collecting data and trying to action it, as kind of Rosa said, of trying to understand the situation and implement change. So being open to sharing, being open to learning, I thought Dr. Lane highlighted nicely of like the need for education, need like upskill of capacity and being open, or I shared the link to Rich's Academy. Of course, I'm biased, but trying to share to upskill our people and get them, our stakeholders, and get them more knowledgeable at certain topics. So this is
Okay, thank you so much. So once again, a very, very big thank you to our panel, and thank you all for your profound responses. Very, very insightful. And I can see that the chat has been very, very busy as you have been sharing your views. So I hope that you're all still with us, and because now we're more than halfway through the webinar. So another short interactive break, just to get you focused. So we'd like you to again answer 2 Mentimeter questions. The QR code will be shown on the screen, and the link will also be put in the chat as well. So the 2 questions, the first one would be, if you could access one piece of data or research evidence to improve your work with girls in sport, what would it be, and how does your organization currently measure success when it comes to girls sport programs? What metrics do you use? Do you wish you were tracking? So, okay, so I can see the question was phrased a bit differently. My apologies. It's now, what intervention do you believe has the strongest impact on girls' participation? And it seems people are leaning more towards policy and funding incentives. Okay, now community-led initiatives are actually leading the way, followed by policy and funding incentives. And then third is coaching education. Okay. So I think these insights actually give us some thought in terms of the direction that some of your work or some of your initiatives should focus on, based on what our panelists and Dr. Lombé have presented up until this point. Okay. Then the next one, how likely are you to apply an evidence-based approach in your future gender equity projects? Okay. It's good to see that a lot of participants are saying very likely. Okay. One neutral. Okay. Okay. So do keep voting, but I will ask Rachel just to change the screen now. And of course, all of these insights will be shared later after the webinar. We now move on to our case study, which will be presented by Dr. Aya Noguchi. So Dr. Noguchi is a former professional football player who transitioned into research and academia. She's currently the Deputy Director of the International Research Center for Sport and Gender at Seijo University in Japan. And she's the CEO and Director of Azitama, a social enterprise that uses sport as a platform to enhance the well-being and development of those in Asia. In 2020, Aya became a board member of Pride House Tokyo, leading a project using sport for a LGBTQ+ inclusive society. And since 2020, she has also led the Japan Sports Agency commissioned Asian Japan Actions on Sport Gender Equality Project, which focuses on promoting gender equality through sport across 10 Southeast Asian countries. Welcome, Aya. It's good to see you again, and thank you for joining us. The screen is now yours to present your case study.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nana, for the introduction. Let me share my screen. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to share my case study and perspective on how data and story together can help us reimagine the gender equality in sports. Over the past decade, we have been tremendous advocacy and policy effort, but despite this, gender gaps remain in participation, retention, and leadership opportunity for women and girls. One of the biggest challenges is that we still lack system comparable data that could tell us not just what is happening, but why. So in my work, I have been leading 2 initiatives related to data collection and monitoring progression that aim to address this gap from different angles. The Japan Sports Pride Index and the ASEAN-Japan Action on Sports Gender Equality Project. The Sports Pride Index measures how inclusive sports organizations for LGBTQ+ community, including queer women and girls, adapting the Japanese Corporate Pride Index into sports-specific framework. It helps sports-related organizations see where they stand and start an internal dialogue for change. Meanwhile, ASEAN-Japan project work with the 10 Southeast Asian countries to develop a regional monitoring framework for gender equality in sports. Here, I believe we should combine quantitative indicators such as quantitative indicators such as participation, leadership rate, with qualitative insight from the stories, interviews, and policy dialogues. Through these initiatives, I have learned that data makes inequality visible, but visibility is only the beginning. Data can enable objective dialogue between policy, research, and practice. Visibility can transform perception into accountability, and measurement becomes not an end, but the shared language for change. However, numbers alone don't tell the whole story. In Japan and in many ASEAN countries, Southeast Asian countries where I collaborate for research and project, maintaining harmonious relationship with families, communities, and organizations is a deeply held cultural values. This means that change often happens in quiet, relational, and gradual ways. It's not always visible in data, but it's very rare in people's daily lives. For instance, in some countries, women coaches may not immediately appear in official leadership positions, but behind the scene, they are mentoring younger women, negotiating gender norms, and building networks of support. Those actions represent agency and transformation. Even before the numbers start to change, if we focus only on metrics, says how many women are in the boardroom, we risk overlooking this agency and context. It will be as if nothing were happening at all. And sometimes when policy pushes too hard for quick number-driven change, it can actually disrupt community harmony or create resistance, which is a risk for women and girls living in certain communities. So data must be interpreted with a cultural sensitivity. That's why storytelling and qualitative data are so essential. They capture the lived experience and the cultural nuances that numbers cannot. They remind us that progress is not just about counting women, but about listening to women, how they navigate power, relationships, and everyday barriers. In the ASEAN-Japan dialogues, for example, it is very valuable to ask not only how many women lead, but also how do women lead? What does leadership look like in your culture? Some cultures are different view of leadership. Those questions open new spaces for learning across very different contexts, from Thailand to Brunei to Japan. So true equality lies where data meets lived experience, that I believe. So how can we move forward from collecting data to creating a culture grounded change? First, I think we need to integrate gender data system into policy design, which is now I'm very working hard on with the ASEAN 10 Southeast Asian countries. That means ensuring every national or regional sports policy include mechanism for data collection and monitoring, not as an optional add-on, but as a standard requirement. Second, we must include qualitative indicators that reflect culture and relational aspects of change. These could include measures of women's decision-making power, perceived safety, or sense of belonging, not just their presence in numbers. Third, we should promote participatory monitoring, where communities themselves collect and interpret data. When local voices are part of the data process, ownership increases and finding resources more deeply. When I worked with Southeast Asian countries, not all countries has confidence to collect accurate data and analysis. So we also have to make sure for the capacity development for people living in the country and the community to collect and analyze their own data rather than someone from global north to do it for them. It brings more trust and fair to understand what the data tell you. Ultimately, true equality requires both visibility and empathy. We need numbers to hold systems accountable, but we need empathy to understand the human realities behind those numbers. As we continue build framework and policy, I remind myself we need to listen not only to what the data shows, but also what people live. So this is the case study that I'm working on, and I found that only the number doesn't tell everything, but I believe that we have to bring their stories and case studies with the data that's more trust and fair understanding of the reality. So thank you very much for the listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aya, for your presentation. It does also give some insight to a part of the world where we don't usually get a lot of information and research from, which is Southeast Asia. So I liked how you emphasized that the data needs to be always interpreted with cultural sensitivity and lived experiences as well, and how those of us who do have the expertise in research need to think about empowering and upskilling implementers to help us in the data collection within the Global South. So thank you so much for your time and your presentation. And I do hope that you'll be able to share the presentation with TAFISA, because I think that there are some participants who would be interested in having a look at your presentation. So now we have, thank you, Aya. So now we are moving towards the tail end of our webinar, and we are now at the Q&A section. Unfortunately, we've had Dr. Lombé and Dr. Lane have had to leave us early due to prior commitments, but I have seen that there are some questions in the Q&A. I will try to get them answered. Not all of them are directed to a specific individual. So whoever is still online in terms of our experts, even including yourself, Aya, please feel free to answer these questions. Lincoln Charles, I'm not too sure how to phrase your question. If you are still here, could you perhaps rephrase your question? Because the question is, using the gap analysis model is the main major toolkit to collect and toolkits for collection and analysis. Your question is, what updated model has been created to speak to recent times? So you said Dr. Lam, so I'm not sure if you meant Dr. Lombé, and she's currently not here. Lincoln, are you still here? Okay. Perhaps Lincoln is not here, but I'll move on to the next question, just for time. So the next one is from an anonymous attendee. As a hot climate country and male-dominated sport, also a developing nation, brackets, lack of funds and support, archery, women and girls are scared to be involved. What are some of the factors to help motivate women and girls to stay and be fully involved? So this question is about specifically archery from a developing country. So what would be some of the factors? I think the person is asking for advice from our experts. How would you advise them to motivate women and girls to take part in archery, which is a male-dominated sport in their country? I hope I've phrased it correctly. Any of our experts? Dylan, thank you.
Yeah, I think Dr. D'Amico said it quite nicely, of like having women in leadership positions at that local context level to make it more comfortable. So this is a strategy, like with weightlifting or even with flying to sports, what we're trying to do to make it to provide that visibility and provide that comfort and that level of support at that level to promote. Let's say, or with weightlifting, my previous position, it was more we were positioning the coaches to focusing on developing coaches and leaders versus developing athletes, and we thought that trickle-down effect would happen.
Okay, thank you very much, Dylan. So the next question is from Shmuel. You've asked 2 questions, but just for time, I will ask 1 question, because I think that's the most important of your questions. So how do data-driven approaches support the integration of girls with health and mental disabilities in sport? So I think the person is asking what type of data-driven approaches can be integrated and help support girls when it comes to health and mental disabilities in sport. Maybe Dr. Rosa DeMarco?
Thank you, Nana. I mean, 2 elements about the question before. I recently have an experience, particularly working with women's archery. I have a student from India doing research in that. And one of the key elements was to speak with parents, okay? To integrate parents in the conversation, so in order to promote. So that was very specific, and I think it's very powerful, particularly from the region she was speaking and her own experience as a former athlete in that sport. So perhaps that can help. The other element, if it is quite true that there is pool data related with women's participation in grassroots sport. I'm talking in general. Now, girls with disabilities even much more. And one of the elements, it's also because we need more teachers to be trained to working with disability. We had worked with several curriculum comparing them, and there is no component related with working with people with disability. So I think we have to build. We have to build in that sense. And my suggestion is to connect. We alone cannot do it. But I know that in several countries there are policies in place in order to inclusion, and that connecting with health secretary, with education departments, I think together it's the way to work and to make it visible, to make more data. Because again, it's not just with people with disabilities, girls and women also, that the data, their participation in sport and or physical activity is not there, is not visible, okay?
Thank you. Now move on to the next question, which I think I will ask Dr. Aya, because this links to her presentation. What do you think is more important and what is needed more when it comes to data for girls' participation? Is it quantitative or qualitative data? This comes from Anonymous.
I think both is needed. If you don't know the reason, the data don't matter. If you have them, you need the reasons, and you have to include the parents for sure, but also the girls themselves. What are their interests and their needs? And if you want to know why they are dropping out, you have to ask them. Very often we hear in safeguarding research studies that nobody asks them. And this is a very important issue. Maybe this goes also to the next question concerning the basic templates for data collection. It was on the one hand a suggestion, on the other hand, we're starting to develop them according to the existing ones from the Council of Europe, and also the Global Observatory in Switzerland with Lombé we are trying to figure out what are existing data sets, questionnaires, templates, and which could be the best ones. So all the organizations are using then similar ones, and this would be helpful then to have them on the different national levels.
Thank you so much for your response, Prof. Rosa, and for answering the follow-up question. So is Dr. Aya Noguchi, are you still with us? Yes, you are.
Yes.
I think I want to ask this next question to you. It's from Eliane Furiyama. How do you create an efficient data collection system that responds to different requirements without putting the burden on the people on the ground? I'm asking you this question because you are working on a 10-country project.
Yes, different.
So how to create an efficient working data collection system that will respond to the different requirements that is needed for your study without putting a burden on your data collection team on the ground.
Thank you very much. I think it's very depending on the which groups that you like to collect the data, because as I mentioned in my case study, I'm working with the government and with the 10 Southeast Asian countries. So it's more for me, it's more important to work. It's very useful to work with the government and made a commitment and agreement that let's make sure to collect the certain data with all countries. If all countries do it, I think that if they agree, they do it. So I think it's depending on the group. I think the channel is a little bit different. So I think it's make sure who you should talk to and what strategy you make and work for this community, I think it's very important. I just can say the case study because this is what I'm working on.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Aya. So this is a question, just for time, this will be my second to last question. So this is for any of the panelists to answer. So it's also from an anonymous viewer. So the question is, are participation rates truly growing across all sports for women and girls? Or is this growth focused on a few high-profile sports that dominates the news? So they just want to know if the growth in women and girls participation is real, or if it's only just focused on certain sporting codes. Anyone can be free to answer.
We laughed because it is real, but it's not enough. Okay, in what sense? Well, you see, of course, the big profiles and that, okay, in the Olympic Games, athletes, but if you speak about coaches, judges or referees or journalists, is not. I mean, there is a gap, okay? Besides that, at grassroots level, it depends on where you are based. And in some places, indeed, it is not motivated for girls to participate in sport, or there is no access to sport, okay? So, and we always compare, and like how often do you change your mobile phone? How often? I mean, how technology has changed so fast. However, we as society, we're still struggling to make it clear to everybody that we need equal access for girls and women to participate in sport. And we are in here struggling to make policies and to ask sport federations to think inequality, not just a small percentage, but equality. So there's still a long way to go. I mean, it is increasing, but it's not enough. This is my opinion.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Rosa. So I see Lincoln, you have come back. So Lincoln, your question you said relates to the 1960 gap model. I would assume that question was referring to Dr. Lombé. You wrote Dr. Lam. If that's the case, she's not online at the moment, but all those questions which we are not able to address now, TAFISA will share it hopefully with the experts, and you'll hopefully get a response in due course. So I think the last question I will focus on is Mikkel Brand. So Mikkel asked, how do we access some of the research to see how to extrapolate it to assist us in our work in the absence of our own data? I think this is an important question, since a lot of academic research at times is behind a paywall. So Mikkel is asking, how can implementers, maybe NGOs, federations, access research to use some of it to help them with their work in absence of their own data? Again, I'll pose it to any of the experts. Can I ask Prof. Rosa Diketmueller, can you perhaps answer this question for us?
Oh, difficult question. The Global Observatory tries to collect the data and to distribute the data. I think this was the question here, to make it possible that also policymakers can have access to it. The idea of the Global Observatory was 30 years ago to start with how the situation has changed and if there is success. And now the way is to collect the data and also to offer it to the public and to the policymakers.
Okay.
I could speak a little bit to what we're, in terms of research, we're an international federation. Research isn't our core topic. One of the strategies we're doing to disseminate academia to our stakeholders is we created a research hub And basically we're taking the abstracts of research papers and the reference and all the full information and creating a bit of our own journal, or like linking these, but then presenting the basic abstracts to our community. So they're able, if you're a coach and there's a research about injuries, you could take the practical implications. Most of the coaches aren't academics. So that like 1 or 2 lines of practical implications to impact their coaching. And in terms of big data sets, we're having different domains of research related to our sport, and we're getting really good views on this. And it's like, I think it's really impacting our community that has interest but aren't academics and aren't delving through journals. They're wanting those few key things, and I think it could also taking the data, or like the implications of the data relative to our sport, to impact change in relative to their context, without having to do all of the legwork of a full academic paper.
Thank you very much, Dylan. So I think some of the last remaining questions, I think, are more administrative questions towards TAFISA. Aoife is looking for a TAFISA representative in Zimbabwe, and Patrick, you want to know how to become a TAFISA member. So somebody from the office will engage with you with this information as well. So again, as I said, due to time, we're unfortunately not able to answer all the questions, but I do hope that the responses given were adequate and they allowed you all to think and to process the information, even though it has been a very, very long webinar. So with that being said, we have now come to the end of our webinar. I'd like to thank everyone who joined us today, even those who had to leave early. Thank you as well. Thank you for taking the time being part of this. And of course, a big thank you to our experts who joined us today. Really appreciate the time, taking time out of your busy schedules and the insights that you have shared with all of us. So before we close, I'd also like to remind everyone here that there is another TAFISA webinar, which will be on the 10th of December. And the topic for that would be engaging youth in sport for all, bridging the gap, building the future. As you can see on the screen, you can scan the QR code to register for that, but then there'll also be further communication from the TAFISA office in case you are logging on from your phone and you can't scan the QR code at the moment. I would also just like to gently remind everyone, once we end the webinar, there will be a link at the end of the webinar, which would ask for you to complete a survey on your thoughts on today's webinar. This will be very helpful if you could complete it so that TAFISA can look at how to continue delivering insightful and relevant webinars. So from me, Nana Aboagye, all the way down in sunny Cape Town, South Africa, thank you all once again for your time, your insights, your questions. I wish you a good morning, a good afternoon, and a good evening. Goodbye and take care.